I'm Martin Mulcair, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with Bianka Grange. Welcome.
Hey Martin, great to be here.
So, we're really keen to hear about your non-business activity, but let's start by you outlining your day job.
Yeah, no, thanks, Martin. As you mentioned, I'm Bianca Grange. I'm the executive manager for Vero SME at Suncorp. What that role is leading effectively our intermediated business packages, product and portfolio team. So I'm effectively responsible for the overarching product development, performance, underwriting, system connectivity, and governance of that Vero SME business package portfolio.
Okay, so this is a very responsible role. So let's take us to your non-business activity, or at least the one we're going to focus on today.
Yeah, so I guess in my spare time or the time that I try and carve out for myself, I am an ethics teacher and coordinator with primary ethics at my children's primary school. So my kids are 8 and 6, so they're in year 2 and year 1. I take a 30-minute class each week for year 2 teaching ethics, and I also take a year 5 class after that teaching ethics. I'll alternate between my kids' classes every other year, so they get to see mum as teacher every alternating year.
Um, Let me just touch on that. This is voluntary, yeah?
Yes, it is a volunteer activity. Yeah.
And how do your children respond to having mum as their teacher?
It's a really interesting dynamic. I know that with some of the other volunteer teachers, as part of coordinating them, some are really open to teaching their children or their grandkids, and some are kind of like, oh no, I don't think that this is going to work out really, really well. I didn't really think twice about it. I took my daughter's kindy class a couple of years ago, and there was definitely a bit of a change piece for her seeing mum as teacher. She wanted to always sit close, kind of felt a little bit strange when I was treating her the same as the other kids and not necessarily as her mum.
Yeah.
But both kids kind of rolled with it really well. It worked out really well. And they both really enjoy having me as teacher. And I get to see a different side of them. Like,
Sure, great,
yeah,
great experience. Now, despite some perhaps skeptical views of actuaries, not obvious what dealing with kindergarten students might have in common with your business role. So perhaps you can take us through some of the skills, some of the lessons you've learned in the classroom that you apply at work.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I'd just add at the start of that, I didn't undertake the volunteering for primary ethics to gain, I guess, professional or business skills. It has just been, I guess, a happy coincidence as part of that process. And I think an eye-opening experience for me about the learnings that you can get from things outside of work that are applicable at work. So what I've kind of reflected on over the last couple of years of taking and teaching ethics, and the very first one that they teach you as part of this is this class, is that my role, even though I'm called a teacher, my role is really around facilitating the inquiry-based learning that the ethics classes aim to deliver. So particularly for the younger, like the K to 2s, I'm telling stories, I'm asking questions, and I'm really getting them to open up and give their own opinions and their perspectives and their responses. And one of the key parts around encouraging that inquiry based learning is to practice neutrality as a facilitator. And this is a really, really interesting kind of concept, because the way that I interpret it is also in how you kind of respond to the kids and their answers to questions. So, really ensuring that I'm creating an environment where any perspective is welcome, any question is welcome, any answer is welcome. There is no right and wrong. And part of practicing that neutrality is being really mindful of, one, my own responses, but also the language that I use in my responses. So an example of that I use is really something as simple as when a child answers a question that I ask, not necessarily saying things like good job or that was a great answer, because I'm not there to pass judgment on their answers, but I really do want to encourage their contribution. So I'm really focusing my language around I guess that positive enforcement around their contributions. So thanking them for their contributions, or thanking them for providing an alternative perspective or adding on to an idea, as opposed to judging, I guess, the validity of their responses.
So that makes sense in the classroom. Can you give me an example of the sort of language, that neutrality, that you would use in the workplace?
Yeah, so when I use it in the workplace, it's again in a similar vein of like, that's a great idea, but I can flip that whilst I'm at work into things like, can you tell me how you came about
Yeah.
with that idea? Or kind of probing some of their thinking around it without necessarily saying, oh, that was great, or I don't agree with that answer. A little bit more of the how instead
Mm.
of whys, and also kind of just not giving my perspective there.
Okay, so neutrality, you're kind of avoiding judgment in the workplace. What else have you learned?
Yeah, kind of in that kind of positive reinforcement is that ability to recognize the language that I'm using in a particular moment. The example here, and as part of the training with primary ethics, is around classroom management, and really getting the kids to behave in a way that is appropriate for learning and within the classroom. So kids, particularly at that kind of 6 to 8 years old, can be fidgety, can play with things, want to be like playing with the hair of the person next to them, or their hat, whatever they've got in their hands can be a bit of a distraction.
Yeah.
um, so part of the training is to really help you focus on a language that is a little bit more directive of what you want the children to do, as opposed to what you don't want them to do. So rather than saying stop rocking on your chair or stop playing with your hat, you give them a little bit clearer of a direction of what you want them to do. So put your hat behind you, or go put it in your bag, keep the four legs of the chair on the floor, etc. And even that, just I remember practicing on the keep the four legs of the chair on the floor. And the first time you try and say stuff like that, it's quite a mouthful, and you have to think in the spot and be really adaptable to go, actually my first instinct is to say stop, but I have to take a moment to not react and say stop, but to kind of respond with what I want them to do.
Yeah.
So it's been this really fabulous training ground of creating those moments where I'm not reacting and I'm not saying stop, but I am actually taking time to respond and think about really quickly as well
Yeah.
what I actually want people to do.
Okay, so I love that switch from reactive to kind of positive.
Yeah.
Again, I'm hoping that in your workplace, behavior management isn't a
Yeah.
highly required skill. But so can you give me some examples of where that positive language is useful at work?
Yeah, it's probably actually not so much the positive language as it is more so that practice ground of what I'm actually doing in that moment is I'm
Okay.
seeing something happen in front of me. There is something that I need to respond to, and I'm really creating space kind of in my mind and with my mouth and not reacting, and having just that space to think about actually what do I want to say and what is really
Yeah, yeah.
needed and intended in this circumstance. And I guess the way that that relates to at work is when I'm listening to my team or my colleagues, and they're explaining some of the work that they're doing. Again, if we're in a setting where there's a lot of stakeholders, I'm taking a bit of a sense check of what's happening, how people are responding, and have given myself, I guess, that practice ground to really hear what they're saying and think about at the same time as also paying attention what I really want to get across in those meetings. So it's probably more that practice and that really safe space to
Yeah.
practice that adaptability.
Yeah.
That's probably more of the important thing. The positive reinforcement is more of that's the outcome that I want to
Yeah.
achieve in the classroom, whereas those outcomes can be really different in the workplace.
Okay, that's a really helpful clarification, really, about what's going on in your head.
Yeah.
Um, what else have you learned?
Yeah, I think the other big piece is just confidence and presentation skills. Like kids are kids, and they can be kind of brutal in some of their feedback when you make a mistake and all that sort of stuff. There's been many times where I've called the wrong character the wrong name, and they're like, oh no, that's not right. There's the picture. It's supposed to be Shadow, and I've called it the other cat's name. So one, the stakes are pretty low to practice
Hmm.
presentation skills. So in the classroom, you get a somewhat prescriptive text which you follow, because that's the protocol of the classes. They have very set curriculum, very set lessons that you need to deliver. There is definitely opportunities to be asking questions and responding to kind of what the kids are saying. But generally, it gives me a good place to have a bit of a script, have a little bit of a story that I need to say. I can do some preparation around getting an understanding of the story, what I need to say, but then actually delivering that to class. I get to practice the level of exaggeration and emotion that I bring to parts of stories. I get to practice either being more prepared or less prepared with the script that I've got. So, how do I still keep the kids engaged while I'm actually kind of reading a story, but then also making sure I'm paying attention to the class and looking up? My head's not always down in the notes that I've got.
So
So,
you've outlined quite a few different aspects of presentation skills. So which are the most valuable for you in the workplace?
um, for me, just the ability to work off a script and sometimes feeling a little bit unprepared. I have an example from effect last week. I had to deliver a speech. I was in a training course. There was a capstone. I needed to talk about myself, and I just hadn't given myself enough time to write it, let alone practice it quite a few times. But I was relatively confident in my capability to be able to stand up in front of a group of it was about 15 people, deliver what I had written. I knew conceptually the points that I wanted to make. I knew where I was trying to go. And because I'd had so much practice doing this with the classroom, even though I was still a little bit nervous, I had a lot of confidence in my capability
Yeah.
to deliver in effectively the same way, but just with a different audience. And that was probably more where the nerves came from, and I could manage that as opposed to what I was actually doing, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
No, excellent example. Thank you. So other lessons, even if they're from other environments, that you'd like to share in terms of skills that you learned elsewhere that you're now applying in your important role?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the kind of thought processes that came out of, I guess, primary ethics, and then through the conversations with you that ultimately led to the insight session that was run last week was, and again, to that point, that I didn't set out to learn anything from primary ethics. It was a volunteer role. I thought it was more meaningful for what it was teaching. I wanted to get more involved with my kids' school, and in a way that felt meaningful to me. And it wasn't until I started talking about what I was doing and taking that real moment to reflect
Yeah.
on my experiences that I'd actually started to realize that I was learning things from ethics that I was then one becoming more aware of and more conscious of, and then those subtle applications that were happening just in the way that I was approaching work and the way
Mm-hmm.
that I was noticing kind of those changes in my ability to respond and communicate became much more cemented in what I was doing and became a much more conscious learning
Yeah.
experience for me. Um, and I found just that idea around reflective practice and what that means. And like we're at that time of year where we're going through or just gone through annual performance reviews, and that's one time that you get to be really reflective on your kind of professional experiences and what you learn. But how can you integrate, I guess, a reflective practice more consciously and intentionally in more aspects in your
Yeah.
life? It doesn't have to be everything. You're not going to sit there and go, oh,
Yeah.
this is how I manage kind of household chores and what have I learned from that sort of thing. But
Mm.
can we be a little bit more focused in not just the things that we do professionally, but also the things that we have going on in our personal lives or in our hobbies or in other activities that we do, where we can engage in some of this reflective practice
Yeah.
to better understand, well, what have I learned? What am I doing with this? Have I learned anything even? And where are those applications kind of showing up? Because that really cements any of the change
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is kind of possibly being undertaken unconsciously into that really conscious
Yeah. Yeah.
level.
Yeah. So this reflective practice is a really interesting concept, and I'm interested in your kind of guidance or advice for the viewers, listeners here. You know, if they wanted to be able to use that more effectively or maybe more regularly. How do you kind of schedule it? Is it how conscious is it, or how does it become more of a habit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'll talk to some of my experiences, but then I'll share some, I guess, maybe tips or maybe ways that you can
Mm,
start. One of the things that I know about myself is I'm a very I'll call it an external learner. A lot of my learning comes from talking.
mm,
So that's the way that I best process things that
okay.
I've learned is really getting it out of my head and usually through a conversation. Um, so I've learned just through just better understanding of myself and how I learn that the best ways for me to kind of learn something or embed anything in particular is being able to replay it and talk about that. So
Mm,
um, part of what I've done, I've been in my role now for 5 months with my new leader. One of the first things that I did with her is explain that to her.
yeah, yeah,
So she
yeah.
understands that I need probably a little bit more time to talk through things. I'm
Yep.
not best at kind of doing
Mm,
written documentations or sending her updates that way. We'll get more ideas and more collaboration happening when I talk through
yep.
my thought
Yep.
processes. So that's what I've kind of implemented at work. In some smaller instances, doing a reflective practice that's really small in somewhat of a frequent basis, which can be either weekly or fortnightly, is just at your end of the week, kind of doing what went well,
Mm,
what didn't go
mm,
so well, and what needs improving. So maybe a
yep.
bit of a stop, start, keep doing. And
Yep.
it's a little bit more, it just needs to be a little bit more than this is the thing that I need to stop.
Yeah.
It just needs to tap into the why. What
Yeah.
was the rationale for that decision to keep doing, to stop doing, to start doing
Yeah.
something? Is just giving yourself that moment to consider why might you
Yeah.
need to do those things.
Okay. Yeah, good practical tips about how that happens. I might go back to the experience with your new manager. It really struck me as, if I can say it, the term very, very mature that you've got the self-awareness to understand how you learn, but also if I say courage, but certainly the opportunity to share that with your manager quite early. So, some people perhaps maybe apprehensive about having those sort of conversations with their manager. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I can understand how it can be how you might be a little bit reserved to do it. And I think it's all in just how you approach that. And I generally tend to do it with a little bit of a question and a bit of an explanation about what I kind of understand about myself. So it
Okay.
starts as a bit of a conversation of like, how did you want to have our one-on-ones? Was there any particular
Mhm.
preference that you have around that? One of the things that I notice about myself is that I might need a little bit more time early on as I like to talk through
Mhm.
at least some of my experiences and what's happening. So, would you mind if I scheduled in maybe a more frequent catch up than
Yeah.
you might have with maybe some of my colleagues or your
Yeah.
other team members,
Mhm.
etc. Because I always think that provided that you are considerate of the impact on the other person around what your preferences might be, because that's ultimately the end of the day they're my preferences and I'm
Yeah.
really asking someone to accommodate those preferences and understand that about me, provided you recognize that that's what you're doing. I
Yeah.
think most people are pretty reasonable in responding to that. There may
Okay.
be some limitations that they have, but it gives them an opportunity to say, oh look, weekly is probably not going to work for me, but let's do fortnightly for a little bit. It just opens the door up for a little bit of, I guess, problem solving
Yeah.
around something that you've kind of put on the table as a
Okay.
preference, but also recognizing that it's going to have an impact on this other person.
That's really helpful positioning. Bianca, it's been a treat. What's final words of wisdom, messaging, guidance for the viewers, listeners?
Oh, I think for me, kind of the final words of advice is really be conscious of the type of experiences that and opportunities that you're giving yourself.
Yeah.
And you don't need, like I said, you don't necessarily need to go out and do them with any particular purpose in mind. Like they don't really have to have like a key, like, oh, it's going to get me to this skill or it's going to get me into this level of,
Hmm.
I don't know, capability or exposed to something really specific. Like all of these experiences that we have, for whatever reasons that could purely just be for your own personal satisfaction that you're undertaking an
Mm.
activity. And those answers are absolutely fine to do those things. I would encourage everyone to do something that they think is either difficult or maybe not one of their strengths, and then just engage in that process of like reflection, whether or not it's talking to your friends about the experience that you had, just sharing that in an article. I know that we've talked a bit about, a lot of our member base really likes to hear about other people's
Mm.
experiences, and just that process of writing down and sharing your experience is a great reflective practice that you can do to benefit other people. So I'd really just say give yourself an opportunity to try something new, even if it feels a little bit scary, even if it feels like something that you're not going to be very good at. You don't have to do it forever. You can just do it for a little
Yeah,
bit of
sure.
time. And then at the end of it, or at a reasonable amount of time, if you take a moment to reflect on it, you'll find that you've learned something, right? And I think that's
Thanks, Bianca. That's great advice to wrap up. I've learnt lots today, so thank you very much again for sharing your experiences.
thanks, Martin. Really enjoyed it.